So, my darlings, good morning. Hello. Welcome back to class. I'm so happy we are starting to get to that point in this skirt when we have built up momentum and the garment is really taking shape and coming together and looking like a garment, which is my favorite inflection point of every project is when it starts to look like the thing I'm making. I feel so much excitement. I feel re-energized. I get a push ready to go to the end when the garment starts to look for reals like something I could put on my body. There's that point at the beginning where I'm just cutting fabric and pressing things, and it's just, I have to do it, but it feels very tedious and like the garment is a long way away. And will I ever get there? And do I even know how to sew? Um, but once I reach this point, I have that excitement. And so we're in the home stretch now. We are putting in our waistband. We started that process in the last session. And once the waistband is in, we can talk about putting in that hem. So all of my stages on this skirt, I am doing by machine because it's going to be covered with a lot of stuff, and the really fine handwork will not be visible to anyone except for me. Sometimes I will do handwork just because it pleases me, but often in projects like this, when none of the handwork will be visible, I turn to the sewing machine so I can spend my time and energy and refinement on the things that are visible and really count from a visual standpoint. Every step counts. Honestly, they're all good steps. But, if I'm going to spend an hour putting in a waistband, I want it to show. So, anyway, we're going to do a machine finish on this waistband. If you want to hand finish your waistbands, you can follow me all the way up to the final step on this project, and it is the same steps. The very last step where you close up the waistband, you just need to go in and hand stitch that using some sort of invisible stitch, the stitch of your preference, really. I usually do like a little prick stitch. That's one of my favorite ways to hand finish things like that. But a lot of people will just whip stitch it closed, just catching a couple of stitches on the front side of the project. And that's also a completely solid finish. But I'm going to show you the machine stuff today. So, what has happened since we were last together? I've sewn my waistband. One side of the waistband is sewn in. Last time we pinned everything in place, so the right side of my waistband was facing the wrong side of my skirt. So right side to wrong side. And I have sewn that long edge into place, including over all of my pleats that I did in the back. And I went in and I zhuzhed my pleats a little bit after we had our session last time. I realized that I'm so used to this being a double or even triple layer of fabric that I was not used to my pleats going in so easily. And I did not believe. So I went in and I zhuzhed them a little bit. But what we're going to do today is press open and then press flat this long seam. And then we're going to be folding the waistband to the right side of the skirt to stitch it into place. I might even remember to trim some of my excess threads. A true sewing sin of mine is that I often forget to trim my threads as I go. And I don't really think of it as like any sort of sin, truthfully, but I know that there are some sewists who are just so distraught when they discover I don't trim as I go because that's one of their habits. And just like I have certain habits where I like to clean up certain things or press in a certain order. When you have a habit of how you handle things and someone else is blasé about that, depending on how your brain is wired, that can be very distressing. So right now, I am pressing the seam open. I'm using my seam stick to help me get it to fold open. That's not strictly necessary. You don't have to have a straight seam stick to do this. You can press it flat on your ironing board. But I'm just going along and I'm pressing it open. And the reason we do this, as I mentioned before, is because it really sets your stitches and it also gives you a nice crisp line for your seam. And you want your waistband to be nice and crisp. I'd say this is doubly the case if you are hand finishing, because the seam you are pressing will be very visible. I'm using a very hot, very steamy iron to press this open. The one challenge with pressing this and also with my current setup around my ironing station is that there's a lot of fabric from the skirt. And so just maneuvering that around so it's not in your way while you press can be the trickiest part of pressing. Okay. So now that I've pressed it from the wrong side, I want to press it from the other side. We've talked a fair amount about pressing through the course of this project, but just in general over the years. And I've definitely been on my own little pressing journey. And I have been inspired and tutored by lots of people to like improve my pressing game. And I do think it is one of those things that we often overlook when we're learning to sew, and it makes a huge difference in the finished product. If you are trying to level up your sewing or your garment making, one of the things you can do to really make a difference is just to learn some good pressing techniques. I love having the pressing tools. They add a lot to my experience, but they are not necessary to get a good press. They just make it possible to work a little less hard to get a good press. So now that I've pressed this open, I want to go back in and now press it flat from the other side so it's ready to be encased in the waistbands. So I pressed it flat and open from both sides. And now I'm going to press the top edge of the skirt towards the waistband so that that top edge will be encased in the waistband. sort of press along here, and then I'm just going to go in with my seam stick and use that as a little um, clapper for this long seam. It's also using the seam stick also reminds me to let things sit and settle after I've pressed them. So one of the big lessons that I come back to is there is an element of necessary patience in sewing. Like sometimes the way to make a thing really come out is just to let it sit long enough for the press to set, or to move slowly with your machine because it's thick and it's fussy, and slow stitching will help you be more accurate. Sometimes speed is not your best course of action. And I'm a natively impatient person, so I don't really love this constant reminder that I need to be patient. But, at least I'm doing something fun while I'm having some personal growth. All right, so we're going to get this pressed, and then we're going to go over to the sewing machine and we're going to stitch everything in place. One of the things I did as I was prepping the waistband was I already pressed under a 1/2 inch seam allowance on the long edge that I knew I was going to machine stitch. So this is all prepped and ready to go already. I also pressed it in half initially, and I ran a row of stay stitching down the center of my waistband.
Is that stitched down the middle so that the interfacing doesn't move, or so you always know where the top is? Or I missed why that was the other day.
Oh, yeah, it's a combination of things. It's one of my favorite things about a technique is when it does multiple jobs, when a single thing does a lot of heavy lifting. So in this case, the stay stitching keeps the interfacing in place, helps prevent some of that movement of the interfacing. It also helps prevent some stretching from your fashion fabric, which can be a real issue when you're putting in a waistband. And it also lets you know where the top of your waistband is. It does all of those things. But the most important job is to prevent against your fabric and your interlining from shifting at different rates of tension and causing your waistband to be really woodgy. So our next few steps as we're finishing the waistband and stitching it in place, we're going to talk a lot about preventing the waistband from sort of stretching and getting weird and woodgy as you're sewing it in. One of the things that drives me so wild when I'm putting in a waistband is when I get this like sort of, instead of having everything, you know, perpendicular to the seam of my waistband, the fabric starts to do this weird thing where I get these diagonal pulls in the waistband, and I get these little diagonal puckers as I go across. That is usually a combination of like tension and movement of the interfacing versus movement of the fashion fabric. And so when that happens for me, it makes me kind of spare. So I work really hard to prevent that.
I have that kind of diagonal thing happen when I go from the regular waistband to the part where it's pleated.
Yeah, oh, okay. So we're gonna look at some techniques for avoiding that issue. The other thing to keep in mind, and part of why I make sure I have a little bit of excess at the end of my waistbands, it's seam allowance, but it's also splash zone, if you will, for a little overflow, because depending on how thick your fabric is, it can eat up some ease in your waist especially when you get to those pleats. So having a little bit of extra room at the end of your waistband and your seam allowance means you have a little bit of wiggle room for that ease that's been eaten up by the bulkiness of your waistband. Now, because I cheated out my fabric and I just have muslin at the top of these pleats, it is so thin, I do not know what to do with myself if I'm being purely honest. It just went in too easily, and I could not believe myself. I was like, what is happening here? Why is this so easy? It's because it's like half as bulky as usual. So, um, but over the pleats can be a tricky area. So we're going to look at that. I have got everything pressed in now, and it's time to get our waistband sewn. I do want to, oh my gosh, pardon me, caught my hair on the back of my dress. I do want to talk about a little technique that I have not mentioned at all, and that is on me. I should have mentioned this a couple of steps ago, so I apologize that I forgot. But one of the things I do sometimes when I want my skirts to have even more oomph in the back over my bustle cage is that I actually put a gathering of petticoat tulle in the space underneath my pleats, underneath on the underside of the skirt. So I just add like a little petticoat netting facing underneath the pleats to give them a bit more buoyancy when I put them on my skirt. I'll try and like do a little mock-up demo of that so I can show you what I mean. But since a lot of you have been, coming in and out of this project and are not necessarily keeping up with me in real time, you still have an opportunity to go in and add this little heading of petticoat net to sort of give this buoyancy to your skirt. It's not necessary, but if you've got something really hefty or you want to have a particularly prominent uh, bustle skirt silhouette in the back, adding a little bit of this petticoat net can really help with that. And I emphasize the petticoat net because it is stiffer and has more loft to it than your regular like tulle net. So you don't want the really soft stuff that feels like a cloud when you crush it. You want something that when you crush it into shape, it kind of sits there and holds that shape a little bit. It's a little bit stiffer. It has a little bit more body and a little bit more loft. All of the net is collecting air that it sort of holds in place, if you will, underneath the skirt to give it a bit more volume. I'm sure there's a more scientific term way of describing it than that. I'm a social scientist, not a hard sciences person, so we're just gonna accept that this is a very imperfect description. And I just happen, really, truly, I just happen to have a little bit of petticoat net right next to my workstation. So this is what it looks like. It looks very akin to normal tulle or nylon net, but you can see it's a little stiffer. See how it just stands at attention? And when I crunch it, it sort of holds on to some of that crunch. It doesn't just go limp on me. So you want the stiff stuff. It's not always listed as petticoat net in places like Joann's or online. It used to be, but I've found in the last few years that's inconsistent. Probably not that many people are making petticoats. This stuff can make a wonderful little interfacing, though, if you need a little bit more volume, a little more stiffness, and you need it to be light. I usually buy it in bulk so that whenever I want it, I can just throw it into things.
Madam, is that the same as crinoline?
Yes, it's the same as crinoline.
So I have four bolts of it?
This one is from Mood, and it is listed as crinoline, and it's their black nylon diamond net. But it's just you want that stiff crinoline or petticoat net experience to give you a little bit more volume in the back. So, and I apologize for not mentioning that earlier because it's one of those tips I absolutely meant to share with you all. It's one of my favorite little tricks for adding a little bit more structure and a little more buoyancy to my bustle because you know I like a big bustle.
I like a
If
big bustle and I cannot lie.
heckin' yes. And if you are like me and you forgot and you're like, oh, that sounds nice, I want that, you can whip stitch a little heading of petticoat net into your skirt back after you've constructed the whole thing. You can actually add this later to any bustle skirt if you're like, it's just too limp. It needs more. You can just fold and gather up some of the crinoline and put it into that heading, um, and give yourself that additional loft.
Okay.
So
So how
it
many
will.
oh,
Oh, go
sorry.
ahead, please.
How many layers do you do? And do you do it the whole width of your pleats?
Yeah, so I normally fold it so it's 2 layers. And I do go the full width of my pleats. So I just do the whole little back panel. And what I typically do is I remember before I put in my waistband and I fold it and I gather um, some into this panel at the back before I put the waistband in. So the raw edges are hidden inside my waistband. I typically make that heading go, like a third to a half way down the skirt. I don't take it all the way to the hem. I just want it to fill in some of the space that falls over my bustle cage. It sort of creates a very lightweight and buoyant faux bustle pad to go on top of your bustle cage. You can also use a bustle pad. And here's if you want to get real mad and go real like extreme bustle action, you can do a bustle cage, a bustle pillow, and some petticoat net crinoline action on top of that. You will have the biggest bustle in town and my respect. So, but yeah, you don't need to go the full length of the back panel to make the whole thing stiff. And in fact, I try not to flatline the back panel with the crinoline because it does make it too stiff. I want this to be a separate piece so the fabric still drapes in the soft, beautiful pleats or gathers that I intended, but has this additional element to give it more volume that doesn't affect the overall drape of the fabric, if that makes sense. So, yeah.
So do you do a 2-to-1 ratio or something bigger?
I usually
Because
do
you
a
can
two to
do a
one.
10-to-1 ratio with that crinoline.
Yeah, you can go pretty tight.
Yeah,
Honestly, so the crinoline is usually what, 120 inches wide, I think.
mine is not that wide.
So this one doesn't say. So
Mine
whatever
is
the
60, but
60.
yeah.
So typically my finished width here, I'm glad we're talking about this, and I'm again chagrined I forgot, but I'm glad we're talking about it. So this is usually like about 10 inches across here. I think mine right now is more like 12 inches across. Um, but which makes sense for my dimensions. But it's somewhere between 8 and 12 inches across in this back panel when you get finished with all of your gathering or pleating. And so I take the width of my tool, whatever that width is, and I simply gather it down to this space. So if it's 60-inch wide and I have 10-inch space, then that's like 6 to 1. If it's 120, I still live that life. I just have more volume. What
That's
you're
10 to
hearing,
1. Yep.
yeah, right? What you're hearing is that I am like kind of loose. I'm a little lackadaisical about this. If it's fits, that's good enough for me. Because if I want volume, I want more volume. Consider me like the Kylo Ren of Bustle Skirts. I just want more. So anyway, yeah, whatever the width of the tool is, I don't cut it down. In other words, I just use the width of the fabric and I make that fit. So yeah,
So the length that you cut is twice the length that you
yeah,
want
yeah.
the
And then
boot.
I just fold it up, right?
So it's like the bottom edge is a fold.
The bottom edge is a fold, exactly right. That way I don't have a rough edge at the bottom. And the main reason, is that even though I've got like a bustle cage and a petticoat and all of this stuff between me and that crinoline or the tulle, the rough edge can still like poke through my fashion fabric or just catch on things. So I love to um have it be a soft edge. Hello, Grand Arbiter. Good morning.
Good morning. I just wanted to bless all my favorite seamstresses with my presence for a moment to congratulate you on being up bright and early for sewing adventures. So that's
Aw,
what I need to do. That's
good
all.
morning, Grand Arbiter. How
Good
kind.
morning. And I hope your crinoline is greatalin.
It is gonna be great, Lynn. Thank you very much.
I'll leave you to it. I just wanted to let you know that I was thinking positive thoughts about you this morning. And I
Thank
hope
you.
at least, I hope the sewing is sewing maximally. Talk to you
Oh,
later. Okay.
see you later, my darling.
Bye bye.
Bye. Um, yes, so I do. I put that folded edge at the bottom of my gathered bit of crinoline. And that way it's not going to stick out through the skirt fabric. It's not going to catch on the skirt fabric. It's not going to catch on the bustle cage or the petticoat. I'm not worried about it sticking into my skin because there's a lot of protection between my skin and the crinoline, but I am concerned about that rough edge catching on things. Now, the crinoline is not itself going to fray particularly, It might it's like it's extruded nylon, essentially. There's very little you can do to it that's going to damage it, but it can still catch and snag on things. So I like to bury those raw edges. Now, I don't have a pair of scissors over here. That would be too helpful. So this is probably 60-inch wide, honestly, because it's as wide as my arms. And so I would just cut, yeah, that double the length that I want. And it's just gonna, oh, it gathers up so nice. And I can really just run a little, typically I do a zigzag stitch to hold it in place. If I forget, as I did here, I'll go in and I will hand tack it in place with stitches that just catch like the backside of my waistband and don't go all the way through. I could take out my waistbands and do this right now, but I'm not going to. I will tell you, if you are somebody who was like, I want this embedded in my waistband. I forgot I have my waistband half in. This now is the time to take out the waistband before you put in the other side. But I am not going to take it apart. I'm just going to probably hand tack some in as I go along with the project. So maybe next time I will prep this and I'll show you how I will hand tack it in. Um, but I'm glad that we at least talked about it.
Yeah,
And
usually when I'm putting in the waistband, it's like the last thing to do before I'm leaving. There's no time to rip it out.
yeah, also, if I'm being very frank, which I'm being frank, I hate taking things out if I don't absolutely have to.
Same.
So there's, go ahead, Cindy.
Oh, I'm not actually happy with how I need to take more bigger darts in my bustle, and I already have the waistband on, so it's just sat there since since we finished because it's just like, oh God, I can't stand it because
Oh,
I just yeah, because my
yeah,
waist compresses like way too much. And
yeah,
not too much, but like more than yeah. So I thought I was
yes.
gonna be happy with it, and then I got it all done, and I wasn't happy with it.
I mean, I have been there, and if if I'm really unhappy with something, it's still it's so frustrating to take things apart and to do them again.
Especially when
Um,
it's like perfectly done, and you're just
yes. Oh,
yeah.
so you all have seen the rainbow bustle dress many, many times. It's like something we wear at almost every convention now. It's so bright and beautiful, and I love it, and I'm very proud of the work I did on it. And generally speaking, I'd say it's fairly comfortable because it's made out of cotton. So of my costumes, it's one of the more cool to wear. But the first time I made it, it didn't fit quite right. There was something weird going on with the center front panels. And I pattern match those panels. It's a plaid, and I pattern match them. But I was like, oh, I have to cut them again. I made a cutting error. I cut them again. I rebuilt the panels. I took the first set out, put those panels back in. Between the first con I wore them at and the second con I wore that dress at. And at that second con, I was like, huh, something's still wrong. The the long and the short of it is I remade those panels and took them out, not twice, four times. And it made me cry every time because they were so beautiful and I put so much effort into the pattern mashing. Um, And some of it is that my body was changing as I was building this garment, and I didn't realize that my body was changing. Some of it is, I had this hernia developing, and some of it is a weird cutting error. I have never been able to track down what happened with that cutting error and why. But I get this kind of strange, now you guys will see it too. And I generally don't like to hone in and harp on my like weird, hyper focused errors that I notice as the creator. But for the point of the story, there's a weird diagonal sort of pleat I get on one side of my body when I wear this garment that I don't get on the other side of the body. And I'm like, where did that error come from? And over the course of trying to fix it four times, I was like, you know what? I never totally fixed it. We're living this life. But it's heartbreaking when you have put something together so beautifully and so perfectly, and the stitching is so good and the finishing is so nice, and you're like, oh, I have to, I guess, take that out again. And the worst. And then
Thoughts and
after four
prayers.
times, I was like, never again.
That's-
Oh, I made a
Yeah.
skirt once and forgot to put the darts in all together. Yeah,
Ah, ah,
that did not fit.
yeah. Uh, sometimes safety pins are my friends in those cases. Um, sometimes I have been known to just take half the waistband out and fix the part that is wrong, and then carefully machine stitch it back in place. Yeah. But I'm with you, Cindy. I'm with you, Martha. I hate taking things apart when they're so beautiful and so perfect. And fixing them is the worst. And those projects will often sit on my workbench the longest because just the thought of taking out my really good work and redoing it is so heartbreaking.
I'm
Emotional
just glad I
moments in
didn't grade
sewing.
the seam allowance there, you know,
Yes. Oh my
because then
gosh.
there wouldn't be enough left to like take it apart and put it back together.
Oh my gosh, the worst.
Yeah.
Alicia says, this is the saga for green and white vest is the same. She probably needs someone to fit it for her. Oh, because she can't reach that backside seam. Oh, Alicia, man, oh man, I hear you. So next year I'm thinking of doing a fitted waistcoat as a workshop, like of this variety. And I'll probably have the option of doing a like more traditional men's style West kit and then the fitted West kit from Black Snail Patterns. And listen, I could never get the fit on that West kit on my own body quite right. So it'll be fun to talk about. Yeah, that's the one. Cindy Joy is showing us. Hold on here. Let me spotlight you so everybody can see the patterns, Cindy. So this is the one, the Black Snails pattern fitted waistcoat. I kind of want to do with you all, as well as a gentleman's style fitted waistcoat in the same workshop. And getting that fit on myself. Listen, I never got that fit on myself. And Captain Azar has shared the link. Thank you, Captain Azar. Okay.
I have cranberry silk velvet from Silk Baron to make a
Ooh.
vest for that to go with
Ooh.
my plaid hat.
Oh, yeah, that needs to happen. That needs to
It
exist
needs
in
to
the
be
world.
hand. It'll have to be hand sewn though, because it's silk velvet. My
Oh,
machine will just
no, that's true. The machine will be unhappy.
thus the
Oh my
vest is
goodness.
not yet made.
But this is just more inspiration for me to put together that class. So we'll make it happen. All right.
You're frozen. Are we?
Am I frozen?
You're frozen. You're like taking your, oh, there you go. You're back.
I'm back.
You're
Okay,
like
great.
lifting your cup to your mouth as you walked, and that was where you froze.
What an attractive moment. Captain Azar says Black Snail is also having a sales right now. Ooh, very nice. So Black Snail patterns, they have a lot more Regency patterns than they do have Victorian patterns, but they do have some beautiful Victoriana and Edwardian patterns as well. And I think their drafting is really gorgeous and they have like a great range of sizes. So I really adore that. They're digital patterns, but Captain Azar knows the place to get them printed. I know a few folks have talked about places where they get theirs printed on the full like AO3 size big sheets, so you're not having to tape them all together. When I did my fitted West kit from them, I taped all those sheets together by hand. And that may also be why I had trouble with the fit. Maybe I didn't do a good job of lining everything up. But it was also excruciating and it took so long. So terrible. I also have to do a full bust adjustment on those things for myself. And that pattern was not very amenable to a full bust adjustment. So that is something I need to work with some more. Okay, so to get back to our current project. So we've got this waistband kind of prepped and ready to go. We have these two folded up edges, and we're going to fold our right sides together now. And kind of, we want to line up our end, make sure our end is nice and, plumb. And we want to have this edge that's not currently attached to the garment. When we go and we fold this, we want it to be just a hair, like a 36th of an inch, a cat whisker wider than the edge that is attached. So you want it to stick out just ever so slightly. We're going to do that on both ends. The reason we do that is so that when we fold it to the front, it absolutely covers the seam. It counts for a little bit of the bulk of the fabric in between. So it gives a little bit of tiny amount of ease for the bulk of the fabric that you have pleated and gathered into your waistbands. And if you're top stitching like I am, it means that you catch all layers, which is really nice. I'm going to do that on both sides. So on my sewing machine, I already have my walking foot in place. I kind of just tend to use the walking foot all the time. But especially for things like a waistband, I love it because it helps prevent some of these issues with the fabric pulling and creating those diagonal sort of like pleats or pulls in the fabric. There was a good comment that came up. Thank you. So we've got the PDF plotting link shared in the chat. Thank you very much, Cindy. Super helpful. I know that we've got a wonderful printer locally in Tucson that's a union shop, and they are able to do all of this stuff for us at a very reasonable rate, just, down the street, which is great. But if you don't have a place like that, then being able to just send the files to a company like PDF Printing so they can print it and send you the finished pages in the big sizes, really nice. Okay, so we're going to go in and stitch across both of these ends at a 1/2 inch seam allowance. And this is my reminder that I like a little tail here. So I give myself a little overlap hanging off the end of my waistband to be like my tab that I use to attach to close my skirt. This tab also gives me a little bit of flexibility in the size of my skirt. So if I am feeling bloated, if I can't tight lace for whatever reason, or not tight laced, if I can't lace as tightly as I normally do, then I've got a little bit of flexibility to move my skirt in and out, which I find really useful. Okay. So the walking foot is not a necessary tool, but if you've got one, If you've never used it on your machine before because you don't quilt or whatever, you can actually use it for things like this. It's a great use for things where you're like, ooh, the tension may be an issue between the different layers of fabric. I hate that. The walking foot will help you correct for that. Okay. Oops. Hello. What are we doing here? Oh, okay, sure. Why not? Let's be difficult. Okay. My little mount is being super difficult. Okay. Can you see the workspace?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah,
Okay.
your angle was a little better a minute ago.
Okay. Is this better?
No, that's worse.
Is this better?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you. It is being very difficult today. So thank you. Thank you. It did not want to move where I wanted to put it.
We're
Okay.
kind of seeing an angle where we were straight on the needle instead of above. So
Yeah.
yeah.
I want you to be able to like see the actual action of the needle into the fabric and how the stitch line goes in and that sort of view that's, most informative. Otherwise, I could just describe to you that I'm sewing while you get the ASMR experience, right? So, um, okay, so I'm going to drop my needle. I always start by dropping my needle. And I'm just going to give myself a little back tack here. Just so right across that end, a 1/2 inch seam allowance. When I come here to the end of that stitch line, I finish with a back tack again. I'm using my standard 2.5 millimeter stitch length. And I know what's coming next, y'all. I know that I am turning this and that it's going to be my corner on my waistband. And so I just go in and I go ahead and I trim. I trim that down to 1/4 inch and I trim the angle there so that it will be a little bit sharper when I turn my waistband. I'm going to do the same thing on the other end. The trick always with trimming this kind of stuff is just to make sure you don't snip through your seam line. I'm going to go in. I'm going to press my thumb really firmly into that point. I'm going to open up this little seam. So my little raw edges look like that. I'm going to take my pointer finger and wrap it on that tip turn it. And if I need to, I'll go in with a little point turner, or in this case, I'm using my seam gauge to sort of push that point out a little bit more. A nice sort of crisp little corner there. Let's go and do that to the other end. So again, I'm going to press my thumb really well into that corner. Normally I use my thumb because it's a little bit more used to being part of the pinching maneuver, but you can use any finger that is comfortable for you. You could use your pinky even. It's kind of like tea dueling holds, though it's all about the set of fingers that feel most dexterous to you. I will say the big tip here is do not use scissors to be your point turner. No matter how careful you are, there's always a possibility of pushing through the fabric with the point of those scissors. So you want something very dull to be your point turner. And your fingers are a great option whenever you can make it work. So now I've got my corners turned. I can turn my entire waistband open into the front of my garment, like so. It's ready for pinning. And I am going to pin this before I stitch. So let's take a look at some of that pinning. Let's talk about that a bit. So stay still. Okay. So I have a friend who is able to put in waistbands so fast without pins. She just like turns and then snaps the fabric really taut and holds it taut and runs it under her machine, and it's great every time. And I admire that, but that is not my lived experience. That is not my skill. I don't know what alchemy she possesses or how she is able to make that happen, but good on her. That's great. Um, I am mortal and I do not have those mad skills. So I have to rely on pins and audacity. And so sometimes a happy visit to the ironing board. We're going to go over to the ironing board. We're going to give this a little press. We're going to pin on a nice flat surface where you can see what I'm doing rather than having me pin in my lap where it's going to be very obscured, or having me pin like 3 inches at a time under the small view in front of my presser foot. So I have my little silk pins that I love so much for this. They're not like necessary, but I work a lot with silk. They're super sharp and they work great for something like this where I have um, several layers of silk fabric that I'm working with. Let's get this pinned in so we can stitch it. Get my iron heating up again. So once I have my waistband all in place and all stitched down, I generally take out that stay stitching I put down the center of my waistband, but I don't take it out until I have everything sewn in place. And there are times I never get around to taking it out because I forget and it blends into the skirt and no one ever sees it. But usually it's one of the last things I do. I absolutely wait until I have the waistband all stitched in though. Okay. So we're gonna do the pressing and the pinning in segments. Typically I press the whole thing and then I divide the waistband in half and I pin from that midpoint one direction and that midpoint the other direction. With the bustle skirt, I often divide in thirds because I want to stitch over the pleated portion and make sure that I've got that nice and because it can be the bulkiest portion and it can do the most to pull things out of whack. All right. My iron is heated, so let's take a look at our pressing. So I've got this little end sticking out here, but it should roughly line up with the underside so that when I go and top stitch, this will get closed even though it's not attached to any skirt fabric here. This is a great place to have your clapper or something else because we're starting to get a number of layers here and the fabric can start to be a little bit less cooperative. I just want the edge of my waistband to cover my stitch line from where I attached it to the skirt fabric. So I'm doing this in segments. So I've got my side, center, front, and into the side panel. I'm going to pin all of this in place. And we're going to look at the center back. There are lots of places where the tension can start getting a little cattywampus. And the pinning is actually one of those places. It's really possible to start pulling on your fabric too much while you pin. So when I'm pinning, I try really hard to just have things laying flat in place where I want them to be and not to yank my fabric into position. Sometimes you do have to um, kind of ease your fabric in where you want it to be. If if you are like having to sort of pull and shimmy your fabric into position to make it work for whatever reason, then more pins, not fewer, to hold whatever nonsense you are needing to do. We've all been there. But in this case, it should just sort of fall into place once I've pressed it, and so I don't need a ton of pins to hold things. The other really fun thing about these particular pins is that the heads do not melt under an iron, which I super love. Okay. So here we are, we're over the pleats. My pleats are not very thick, again, because they're just the muslin. If your pleats are a little thicker, it could become a little bit more tricksy. My waistband has just the tiniest bit offset from my skirt fabric. That's fine. I'd say that my fabric probably slipped a little bit when I was pleating and shifted. But if you have really thick pleats, having a little bit of a tail like this can provide you some ease with which to encase the thick fabric. Again, I'm lining this folded edge up so that it just covers my stitch line. I go in here and clap that. Again, clap that nonsense. Try not to clap your fingers under the clapper. That does not feel good, by the way. And once this is set and cools off a bit, then I'm going to go in and pin it in place. And often I start in the middle of this run. So I'm going to start in the middle of my box pleat and just put a pin there. I'm going to pin this direction, and then I'm going to pin this direction so that as I'm pinning any sort of inadvertent pulling and shifting of the fabric that I do, sort of balances out. I am being more persnickety than I maybe need to be. The fabric is being very cooperative. The waistband seems to be going in, pressing in very nice. But the number of times I think that everything is going just fine, I go in and stitch, and then I end up with weird pulling is a non-zero number of times. So I like to prevent that as much as I can. I'd rather be persnickety here than have to take things out later to satisfy my OCD later. Okay, so now I have this all pinned and ready to stitch. what's going to happen is that we're going to go back to the machine and I'm just going to be edge stitching everything, but again, in segments. Also, I pinned it and I noticed it needed a little bit more pressing. So I just went in and pressed it some more. So I'm going to be stitching it in segments. I usually find roughly like a halfway point and I start stitching out from that direction. And sometimes I reverse my skirt and stitch the other direction, depending on what's going on, and how woody it's being. But usually, if I at least just go in runs where I am not trying to go the full length of the waistband, and build up more weird tension across the waistband, then it helps avoid the diagonal pull. Okay, any questions before we go back to the sewing machine and put in our row of stitches? Yes, Cindy says she uses her walking foot for almost everything. It makes things so much easier. It really does. It helps a lot. The walking foot makes a huge difference. I probably don't need to be as careful as I'm being because of my walking foot, but not everybody has a walking foot. Not everybody uses a walking foot. And I like to talk about all the tricks, especially if I remember them. I'm thinking about that petticoat net from earlier and how I totally forgot about that particular tip. So let's go stitch this in. I'm excited, everybody. Oof. I'm excited, but Cake is napping. He's pulled down some fabric and he's made himself a little nest. Hey, sweet boy. His life is very hard. I've folded my skirt in half to find this sort of like roughly midpoint, and I'm going to sew forward from that midpoint for the first run of stitching. And I'm not usually this careful. I just put a clip in here. Normally I just go, okay, there's roughly the midpoint. I'm going to like stitch from there forward. So, and as Cindy says, if you have a walking foot, you probably do not need to be this persnickety. And if you have the magic touch of my friend I was talking about earlier, then you could do whatever you want. Waistbands are clearly your butler and they do your bidding. And I'm so happy for you. But I do not have that talent. So, and when I'm not using my walking foot, I have to use every other trick in the book to make this stuff work. Okay. So before I pull you in so you can see what I'm doing, I am going to be stitching in fairly close to the edge. I normally am like within an eighth of an inch to a 16th of an inch, or even closer to the edge when I edge stitch. But as long as you are consistent and do the same width of stitching down your edge, you are okay. I will say that working up your edge stitching so that you can do things like an eighth or a 16th of an inch away from the edge is really nice. It makes a nice finish when you're doing edge stitching. But if you're like within that quarter inch or smaller range, you're doing well. You just want to be consistent. Do the amount in from the edge that is comfortable for you. If you go in more like a half of an inch from the edge, you're no longer edge stitching. You're just stitching on top of your seam allowance and you're not going to have a good finish. So you want to be fairly close to the edge. Okay. Let's see if this will cooperate. How's that view, everybody?
Perfect.
Yeah, looks
Great.
great.
Oh, man, sometimes it cooperates. So I'm very close to my edge here, and I'm using, again, a little point on my walking foot to be my guide so I can line up the edge of my fabric with the same position on my walking foot to keep things even. I drop my needle. I'm going to give myself a tiny, very tiny, like 1 to 2 stitches of a back tack here. I don't want a big one because I'm going to be sewing up to this point from the other direction. I do want to sew through all layers to the best of my ability. And you can go a little bit faster in your stitching here, but I usually start out with slow and steady to make sure that things are lining up okay. You'll notice that I kind of sew right up to the straight pin. Sometimes I'm more lackadaisical, but these pins are really helping to keep things from pulling weird. That's one of their jobs. And so sewing up to those pins helps maintain the position of the fabric. As I come to my end here, I'm just going to give myself a little back tack. So I've got a nice little edge stitch happening there, and I caught all of my edges, so this little tab is totally closed now. This is where I can decide, okay, is this being really woodgy? Do I need to actually turn this around so I'm stitching away going that direction? Or is it being pretty cooperative and I can stitch in the same direction because it's not really pulling? And if I'm getting some pulling, if it feels like it's really fighting me and wanting to do the diagonal pull, then I'll just wad up all of my skirt fabric into the throat of the machine, which is a pain in the tuchus, but you can do it if you have to. In this case, I'm probably fine just stitching towards the point I started. So I'm going to line it up in the same position with my presser foot. I'm going to just drop my needle. It gets thick enough here that you might need a hump jumper depending on your fashion fabric and the thickness of your pleats. But you can see I'm already getting a little bit of puckering here, a little bit of fabric pushing up. And that could lead to things getting out of whack. So I'm just going to take my little seam gauge. I'm going to hold that down and make it my butler until I can come up on it.
Did you back tack?
I did. I did a very quick back tack. I didn't say it. I try and make a habit of saying exactly what I'm doing with all the steps. Um, because we have all like levels of psoas, but also if you're following along and you're tired, sometimes having that reminder is very helpful. So this is a trick I learned from watching Anthony Ladd Canny. So really beautiful couture gowns for drag queens, actually. And he will use like a little um, card from like a hotel room key card or something like that. That's just a very so springy plastic flat piece. But the seam gauge here is kind of springy, flat, and readily available. Does the same kind of trick. But when you're sort of trying to keep things in place and keep them from puckering on you or moving out of place, sometimes you need an extra proverbial finger that is not going to get sewn through by the needle, but also has a very flat profile. I could do this with my finger, but it's like a little bit more awkward and it's not as flat. I can't get it as close to the presser foot. So Anthony Canny used to make gorgeous steampunk garments, which is how I learned of his work initially. And he used to make these absolutely stunning corset uh, waistcoats for gentlemen. Yeah, just, oh my gosh, true works of art. And then he got into making gorgeous frocks for drag queens. If you watch Drag Race, he has made a lot of looks for Violet Chachki, and uh, so a lot of her iconic, stunning looks actually come out of his workshop first, which is fun. And I'm pretty sure he makes more money and has a really lovely life sewing gorgeous frocks. But I love this trick when fabric's being a little bit persnickety.
All those pleats too, that's where if you're not careful, they'll like tuck up underneath the waistband on the other side.
Right, they
Wind up
will.
having to take stitches out.
Yes, the pleats are the place where things can be the cheekiest and the most like recalcitrant and everything else. And when Cindy is right, they are the ones you have to watch for, especially if it's very thick there. I know when I'm using like um a double or triple layer of fabric there that the thicker they are, the more likely they are to sort of like get cattywampus and pleat up and do a weird thing. Now that we're through the pleats, it's kind of smooth sailing. I'm coming up to where I started my original run of stitching. And when I get to my original little back tack, I'm going to give myself a matching back tack here, just a tiny little guy. And now my waistband is in. And pretty smooth. You can see there's a tiny bit of like place here where it wanted to get a little puckery, a little, a little pulling there. But mostly it is nice and smooth with no pulling and no weird like diagonal sort of pleating. And none of my pleats here on the inside got caught up in my waistband. So it is good to go. I don't have to pull it out. I don't have to curse the sewing gods or the fates. It is just ready for my next steps. So let's talk about those next steps, shall we? Because now our skirt is starting to look like a skirt. So you may remember that I leave my final seam open, the one that has the placket and facing in it, until I've put in my waistband, because it's a little bit easier to put in a waistband like this when I don't have my skirt, sort of like in the big tube and catching up on things. I can have a nice flat surface to work with up until this point. It just makes it a little easier. So now I'm going to go in here, line up my facing and my placket on this seam, make sure my waistband is essentially lined up. And we're going to prep this final seam here and get it stitched together. So next session, we're going to be talking about the hem. In between now and then, I'm going to have this hanging up so that any little bit of bias stretch drops out. There's not a lot of bias on most of these panels except for the back panel. That one, because of the nature of the curve, there is some bias. You can have some stretching. So it's nice if you've got the time to let the fabric stretch a little bit. And I like to do that once I've got the waistband in, because then I've got a good edge to hold onto with my hanger. So make sure you've snipped into the seam allowance next to your facing and up to any stay stitching there. And the same with your placket. You want this raw edge to be able to be flat. For those of you who did not get to see the placket done in real time, we will get a video up of me doing that. So you'll get to see what that looks like. And to be honest, there will be more plackets in our future, because anytime I do a skirt, petticoat, any of these things, I do my placket essentially the same way. So once I've got this snipped and lined up, I just go in with some clips. It's not particularly woodgy at this point. It's not as tricksy as putting in the waistband. It's more willing to do my bidding. So my hem all the way around this skirt is going to get covered by a pleated ruffle. Probably going to do a pleated ruffle. I may change my mind and do a gathered ruffle. I may ask your opinions next week, but it's going to get covered by a ruffle. So I'm going to be doing my hem entirely by machine. It's not going to be visible. And I've mentioned this a couple of times. If you want to do your hem by hand because it's going to be visible, I've absolutely done that a number of times. I find it deeply satisfying. It has the most beautiful, like, couture look to it when I do it by hand. It's very nice, but it's also like 120-inch or wider hem. That's a lot of hem to hand stitch. That's like a couple of hours of hand sewing. Usually, when I'm doing a hem that length, I measure it by how many Marvel movies I get through. Or if it was like a whole installment of The Lord of the Rings. And so, a hem of this length, typically that's going to be watching either the Fellowship of the Ring from beginning to end, the extended director's cut, or it's going to be watching, the first Thor movie and the third Thor movie, because I normally skip over the second one because it's depressing. So, anyway, it's good. It's just depressing. So I've got this clipped. You can see that this panel is longer than my back panel. I made a cutting error. I have a plan for it, but like we will talk about how Madam makes mistakes all the time next week or next session in our hemming installment, and how I am able to correct for this because of the nature of how I am fixing the or doing the trim over my hem. But I really appreciate checking the lengths of my panels before I go forward. And I caught this error pretty quickly, but I decided it wasn't worth it to recut it because I know I was covering my hem with a ruffle. So it's fine. Sometimes you can cover your mistakes up with beautiful trim. I do it all the time, actually. Is it a mistake or a happy little accent? Are we having a Bob Ross moment? I think we are. Okay, so I'm just gonna go in. This is like a normal row of stitching. Nothing fancy here. Oops. There we go. Drop my needle. Going to back tack. And I'm doing my normal 1/2 inch seam allowance. The skirt is starting to get heavy and bulky and pull as I'm sewing. So there's a little bit of moving the fabric around so it's not pulling too much on my seam as I'm stitching it. Now I'm coming up here on my placket and facing. I'm going to stitch right up to the bottom edge there. And just a little bit into the facing. And then I'm going to give myself a little back tack. And now this final edge is done. Our final seam is in. All we have left is trimming the skirt, putting the hem in the skirt, putting our hooks and eyes in. But if we had to, we could go as a sort of Cinderella look at this point because the skirt is wearable. You just be like, oh, our evil stepsisters pulled off all our trim and pulled out our hem and pulled out our hooks and eyes. So I'm just steampunk Cinderella. I totally finished my skirt on time. Um, yeah, not my fault. But so we've got this last seam in. I typically go in here at this point and I press this one flat and open as well as I've done with my other seams on the interior of the skirt. Um, that is, again, so you get a nice crisp seam and you really embed your stitches. But it's always a good idea to check before you press that you're actually happy with your stitching. So always check before you press. It's better to unpick your stitches before you've pressed them. Doable, but nicer to do it before you've pressed. But this is us. We've got our skirt body together.
I have a small question.
Yes, ask away.
So the placket that sticks out, do
Mhm.
you leave that loose or do you tack it across at the bottom?
I usually leave it loose, Cindy. Um, I know some people tack theirs at the bottom. I usually leave it loose because I'm a big lady and I really pull that
About the maximum.
right. So it's nice not to have it attached. Um,
So do you
what's
do a like a um really short zigzag across the bottom?
so this is a great question that Cindy's asking. Once you've pressed open, part of the challenge here with the placket and the opening is that as you are pulling it on and off, there's a lot of strain on that seam. And so the head of the seam, even though you've back tacked it, can come undone. It just, the stitches are under a lot of strain. So if you are trying to prevent that strain, you can go in once you have pressed it flat and just put a bar tack at the top of this seam right under your placket and facing. And let me so finger press that open and show you guys what that looks like. It's better to press it before you do the bar tack, but this is muslin. It's very accommodating. And very thin, so it's easy to like sort of convince it to lay flat. But this is definitely one of those, I said this thing, but let's see this thing. So a bar tack is essentially just a zigzag stitch. Like you would do for a buttonhole. You'll see them talked about in things like putting in welt pockets and things like that. When I'm doing welt pockets, um, I have like a different approach. I don't like having a visible bar tack on the front of my waistcoats and things. So I usually do some internal things to reinforce it. But a lot of people, when they're doing machine welt pockets, will put a very narrow bar tack that, if you look, is visible on the top of the garment. No big deal. It's just not my particular favorite finish for that. But for something like this, where it's going to be covered by an overskirt and you're never ever going to see this little bar tack, it can be very helpful to have this to reinforce the head of that seam. So hopefully you can see that I've got this pressed open. My placket goes like so over the facing. I've got it sort of folded out of the way for the moment. If I have my seam allowance finger pressed flat, gonna do a sort of medium zigzag with a very narrow stitch, just like I would be putting in a buttonhole. Drop my needle. I'm stitching right over the head of that seam. I've centered the seam here. Sort of. I've centered the seam the wrong direction. Oh my gosh. Let's start that again.
I was like, this is interesting. That's 90
Yeah.
degrees off from what I do. But
It is 90 degrees off from where it should be, is the answer. I should have had more tea. Okay, so we want to center that seam again, going the right direction. And hopefully my light will like brighten up there. That's funny. So now we've centered the seam. We want the zigzag to go across the seam, not next to the seam. And I just do like 3 or 4 little passes, and then I give myself a little back tack there. And when I'm done with that, I have this little bar tack that will be like a backstop so that when this seam is being opened,
you're off camera. You
oh,
need to move to the
you know what? Here, I'm gonna do it so I can see what I'm doing. Oh, come on.
More
There we
tea
go.
is always the answer.
Yeah, more tea is always the answer. So there's the little back tag here at the top so that when this opens like this and I'm getting into it, it has like a backstop where the seam is reinforced and those stitches really cannot come out and rip on you. And so that's really nice, especially if it's a garment, if you're going to be wearing it a lot, and opening it to its fullest possible extent, as I like to do, to get it over my head and my coiffure and everything else. And then when it's all closed and clean, you've just got this little tiny bar tack right here at the base of that seam. I didn't get it quite up as high as I could have, but it's good enough to reinforce the head of that seam. So that's it. It's a great question from Cindy Joy. It was a good opportunity to share a little extra finesse for the head of the seam, since I don't sew across my placket and facing, and I leave that so it will open to the full extent. Yeah, because I am irrepressible and I do big hair and I have a lot here that I need my waistband. Honestly, my bust measurement is wildly larger than my waist. And so I need a lot of room to get over my bosom when I'm putting my clothes on. More than my hair, more than my shoulders. My bosom is just like one of the larger measurements on my body. And so I kind of need the full expanse. I pull my skirts on over my head. It's really hard to step into a bustle skirt once you have all your underpinnings on. So I have to go top down. Anyway, I hope that answered questions. Great questions, everybody. Martha, Cindy, wonderful questions today. Alicia, great additions today. Thank you for bringing our Poe energy with your pendulums. It's wonderful. Captain Azar, thank you for keeping us organized and on and like bringing all the knowledge to the comments. I really appreciate all of you. So wonderful being here with you. And I've loved working on this project with you. We are in the home stretch. We've got the hem. So here is a little bit of sort of logistics for the rest of the project. We're going to put the hem in. We're going to talk about hemming next session, but we are not going to start doing the trim because the trim is a big process. There's a lot to go on with the trim, and trim is very particular to each garment. So all of you are probably going to do different trim than I'm doing for my skirt. That means I can't be like, this is the trim you put on in this place. All I can do is tell you, these are some of my aesthetic suggestions for how to trim out your skirts. What we are going to do is once we've put the hem in, there's going to be a little break. I'm going to Tucson Comic Con with the Tucson Steampunks. And then after that, we're going to have a special 1-day workshop, sort of like we did for the fan lacing, where we look at all the ways you can manipulate box pleats to make some really interesting trim elements for your garments. And I'm going to talk about how I will be using box pleats and some of the things I've learned about trimming out my bustle skirts using box pleats to make some really interesting hem finishes. After we do box pleats, you can let me know. Do you want to look at interesting ways to do knife pleats or interesting things to do with ruffles or different kinds of trim elements that you would like to focus on? And I will work in special 1-day workshops where we just look at different elements of trim and the ways you can manipulate that fabric to do cool things for cool treatments on your bustle garments, and frankly, on your Edwardian things, on your like 18th century garments. A lot of this fabric manipulation for box pleats and ruffles and gathers and ruching, all of that has been around for a long time. You see it all over 18th century garments for like those big, gorgeous French gowns with their peignets and everything. They're covered in box pleats and ruching and weird gathers and all sorts of furbelows, and it's wonderful. But I would rather focus on a style of manipulation at a time rather than just like tell you, now you trim it out. Goodbye, good luck. So that's going to be our kind of process. We'll hem it. And then after I've had a moment to catch my breath, we will have a little 4-hour workshop on box pleats. I'm excited. I love pleats. I use pleats a lot for all of my garments. I come back to pleats all the time. I have an obsession. It's fine. It harms no one. So anyway, so that's what's coming up for us. But this coming session, Wednesday night, we're going to look at hemming. I will talk about some sort of nicer techniques for doing a hem by hand, talk about hem facings and all of those things. Again, I'm going to be doing a very simple hem on mine by machine because it's getting covered. But if you want to put in a really nice hem by hand, I'm going to talk about some of the techniques for doing that. So, and Alicia's all like, you will steal my knife pleats from my cold, dead hands. I am here with you on that. So yeah, I love a knife pleat too. When I'm not doing box pleats to manipulate them into different shapes, I put a lot of knife pleats on the hems of my skirts too. Yeah, like so many of them have a deep ruffle that's just knife pleats. So I love pleats. So that is what we're going to be doing though in September is we're going to look at pleating and manipulation. And then at the end of September, we're going to get into another corsetry workshop. My intention is to start that workshop on the 22nd of September. I need to get all of the things in place, including your materials list and everything for that. But my goal is to set it up so that we finish the class the week before the election. I don't know about you all. As much as I love hanging out with you, and I do, I think that week everybody's going to be pretty stressed out and pretty anxious, and we may not be feeling like we want to hang out and sew on a corset. So my goal is to have that class scheduled so that we are ending right before the election and not worried about putting in boning channels and watching election results. I also wanted to be done before things like TeslaCon. So November has one of the biggest steampunk conventions in the country happening every year. November is TeslaCon month. I feel like things like TeslaCon and Wild West Con are sort of like their own little black hole that has an event horizon. And once you get past that event horizon, the gravity well pulls you in and your life becomes that convention. So that's it. That's all the updates and logistics. Thank you all for being here with me today. It was so wonderful. Great class. We're in the home stretch and I'm very excited to put this hem in with you. Any questions before we wrap up?
I have a question.
Yes.
Since I wasn't here for Placket Day,
Mhm.
do you use skirt hooks or the little hooks and eyes on your placket?
I use skirt hooks.
Okay.
I use the big guys.
Okay. And then you had made that extra 2 or 3 inches or whatever in case your weight fluctuates. Do you put
Mhm.
like 2 rows of skirt hooks on the one or whatever bars on the one side just in case?
Yes, I do. I usually put a bar every inch to half inch on the other side. Usually an inch, unless I'm like, no, I'm really tight lacing in this. I better give myself half-inch intervals. So, but usually I find doing an inch is enough. So I put a couple of extra bars then on the waistband. And I make sure that I put enough bars that I can make it an inch smaller to like 2 inches wider, typically. So, yeah.
Okay. So just on the waistband then, not on the placket itself?
No, because honestly,
Your
at
hips stay
that
the same?
point, you're going to have a little V at the placket if you're having to like open it up, which is fine. Or I'm getting overlap. So it's a different. So those hooks and bars on the placket are not going to match up really well, period, if I have to overlap the waistband.
Right.
But also at that point, the waistband is either overlapped because I've had to make it smaller, or I'm really grateful that I wear an overskirt because there's a little bit of visibility there. I could always make my placket wider so that there's more coverage under that opening if I need it. So I've done some um like walking skirts in the past that were sort of a more Edwardian shape. This was like early on in my steampunk days. And they would have like a center back opening, no overskirt. And I would do like a 4 inch wide placket for those so that they would have more coverage if I needed to adjust it open. I'm very pleased with this taken directly from historical extant garments. I know they love to hide their pockets all over the place, and they would hide them in surprising places. In that one, I have a pocket that's hidden in the top edge of the bodice under the trim so that I can actually, it's perfectly sized for like an ID, a debit card, a room key card at a hotel. It's just like you can slide that right in, or business cards. very handy, very easy to get to when you're coming in and out of your room. But the center back pocket, like on one hand, yes, it's kind of hidden under your petticoats and everything. It's obscured. But I'm just like, how do you get in and out of it? It's so great. Next time we'll work on our hem and then we will adjourn for a little bit until we meet again in September. Captain Azar is working on the videos, has already gotten me some of them, and they have gone up onto YouTube, so they will be going on to Patreon very shortly. And I'm excited to see what you do with your bustle skirts. All right, my darlings. And now with that, we are going to say adieu. I will see you on Wednesday. Please take very good care of yourselves. I'm so excited to keep sewing with you.